A poster hung on a wall reads, "Our plan, your plan," against a backdrop of yellow diagonal stripes. The poster conveys information on alert levels and guidance on social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic. It indicates that more information is available at COVID-19. Goft, NZ, Figure 13. 1. The New Zealand government distributed pamphlets and hung posters to disseminate information about adjusting to life during the COVID-19 pandemic. New Zealand's lockdown was among the strictest that governments imposed during the pandemic. Credit, New Zealand Government /Wikimedia Commons, CC by 40. Chapter Outline. 13. 1. Contemporary government regimes, power, legitimacy, and authority. 13. 2. Categorizing contemporary regimes. 13. 3. Recent trends, a liberal representative regimes. Political power is organized in the form of governing regimes or governments. Underlying institutional patterns have emerged among the wide variety of these regimes across different regions of the world and in different periods of time. These different approaches to governance are evident in the ways various regimes seek to address common challenges and achieve desired goals. During the global COVID-19 pandemic, for example, some countries swiftly enacted lockdowns, mask mandates, and other policies aimed at reining in the spread of the virus, while other countries took more of a wait-and-see approach that prioritized individual freedoms. When you draw distinctions among varying types of regimes and detect trends in contemporary governments, you can come to our own conclusions regarding which regime is best for addressing these kinds of challenges. To these ends, this chapter will look at governing regimes both conceptually and in reference to a range of concrete examples drawn from governments around the world. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the nature of governing regimes, define power, authority, and legitimacy, explain the relationships among power, authority, and legitimacy, discuss political history and contemporary political and legal developments surrounding governing regimes. A government can be defined as a set of organizations with their associated rules and procedures that has the authority to exercise the widest scope of power, the ability to impose its will on others to secure desired outcomes over a defined area. Government authority includes the power to have the final say over when the use of force is acceptable, and governments seek to exercise their authority with legitimacy. This is a complex definition, so this section unpacks its elements one by one. A government both claims the right and has the ability to exercise power over all people in a defined geographic area. The leadership of a church or a mosque, for example, can refuse to offer religious services to certain individuals or can excommunicate them. However, such organizations have no right to apply force to impose their will on non-congregants. In contrast, governments reserve for themselves the broadest scope of rightful power within their area of control and can, in principle, impose their will on vast areas of the lives of all people within the territories over which they rule. During the COVID-19 pandemic, only governments both claimed and exercised the right to close businesses and to forbid religious institutions to hold services. The pandemic also highlights another feature of governments. Almost all governments seek to have and to exercise power in order to create at least minimal levels of peace, order, and collective stability and safety. A uniformed police officer from the Chinese People's Armed Police Force wears a helmet with a face shield and holds a clear plastic shield. The officer is surrounded by people including police officers, news media, and other people standing outside a building. Figure 13. 2. China's armed police force imposes government-sanctioned order. Credit. China Armed Police Force by Michael Mooney/Flickr, CC by 20. As German social scientist Max Weber maintained, almost all governments seek to have and to enforce the right to have the final say over when violence is acceptable within their territory. Governments often assert what Weber called a monopoly on the right to use violence, reserving for themselves either the right to use violence or the right to approve its use by others. 1. The word monopoly might be misleading. In most countries, citizens have a right to use violence in self-defense. Most governments do not maintain that they alone can exercise the acceptable use of violence. Where the government recognizes the right to use violence in self-defense, it will seek to reserve for itself the right to decide when, in its judgment, that use is acceptable. Imagine a landlord confronting a tenant who has not paid their rent. The landlord cannot violently seize the renter and forcibly evict them from the apartment. Only the police, an agency of the state, can acceptably do that. Nevertheless, the law of many countries recognizes a right of self-defense by means of physical violence. In many U.S. states, for example, if a person enters your house unlawfully with a weapon and you suspect they constitute a threat to you or your family, you have a broad right to use force against that intruder in self-defense, a principle that forms the core of the Castle Doctrine. In addition, private security guards can sometimes use force to protect private property. The government retains the right to determine, via its court system, whether these uses of force meet the criteria for being judged acceptable. Because the government sets these criteria, it can be said to have the final say on when the use of force is permissible. Authority. Authority is the permission, conferred by the laws of a governing regime, to exercise power. Governments most often seek to authorize their power in the form of some decree or set of decrees, most often in the form of a legal constitution that sets out the scope of the government's powers and the process by which laws will be made and enforced. The enactment of codes of criminal law, the creation of police forces, and the establishment of procedures surrounding criminal justice are clear examples of the development of authorized power. To some degree, the constitution of every government authorizes the government to impose a prohibition, applicable in principle to all people in its territory, on certain behaviors. Individuals engaging in those behaviors are subject to coercive enforcement by the state's police force, which adheres to defined lines of authority and the rules police departments must follow. Governmental regulations are another type of authorized government power. The laws that structure a regime usually give the government the authority to regulate individual and group behaviors. For example, Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution authorizes the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. When large commercial airlines fly individuals across state lines for a fee, they engage in interstate commerce. The federal government therefore has the authority to regulate airline safety requirements and flight patterns. Pursuant to this authority, the federal government has established an agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, to issue these regulations, which are ultimately backed by the state's coercive enforcement power. Weber argued that those who structure regimes are likely to choose, on the basis of the regime's own best interests, to create authority that is clearly spelled out in a regime's constitutional law. 2. When lines of authority in the government are clear, especially in the context of the state's criminal law, the people living in a regime are less fearful of the state. This helps the state secure the people's support. When the scope of the government's authority is clear, people can understand how their government is structured and functions and are therefore less likely to be surprised by governmental actions. This can be especially important for the economy. To follow the example above, if laws regulating the private ownership of commercial airlines are constantly open to unexpected change, some people may be wary of working in the industry or investing their money in these companies' stock. Predictable governmental action can encourage these investments. With increased economic activity, the government can tax the productive output, amassing resources to help it achieve whatever its goals might be. In addition, clearly defined structures of authority in the form of stable bureaucratic institutions allow a government to exercise power more efficiently and cost-effectively, once again enabling it to amass more resources to serve its objectives. 3. The use of physical force to directly restrain behavior is just one of the ways governments exercise power. Governments also tax. In a sense, the taxing authority of government is a necessary corollary of its authority to impose behavior-restricting rules. Almost all governments must derive revenue through taxes in order to finance the maintenance of their laws and to ensure peace and public order. However, that authority also allows governments to exercise power to achieve a wide variety of ends, funding everything from foreign wars to a social safety net or a set of social programs. Taxation is another way governments regulate people's behavior. If you don't pay your taxes, the government is authorized to punish you, a principle true across the world, even if the levels of enforcement for not paying taxes vary across regimes. The authority to tax illustrates another aspect of governmental power, the use of authority to shape society by creating incentives for particular kinds of behavior. In the United States, the federal tax code enables taxpayers to deduct large charitable donations from their taxable income as a way to encourage individuals to give to charities. Additionally, homeowners can deduct the interest they pay on their home mortgage, thereby reducing their annual federal tax obligation. This use of government power is meant to encourage people to own homes rather than rent. In the United States, at least, the federal government has encouraged homeownership due to a belief that homeownership helps people build closer ties with and involvement in local communities, and thus increases civic participation, and that owning a home correlates with greater levels of long-term savings, which can provide individuals greater financial security in their retirement. For some people, their house is their largest asset, which can help to finance their retirement. Conversely, governments can impose sin taxes, that is, taxes on products like alcohol and cigarettes, discouraging their use. Some lawmakers have proposed levying higher taxes on bullets to discourage gun violence, and some areas have taxed sugary soft drinks to discourage their consumption as a way to improve public health. 5. Show me the data. A map shows state cigarette tax rates as of December 2021. 13 states and territories have cigarette tax rates of less than $1 per pack. 15 states and territories have cigarette tax rates between $10 and $1.99 per pack. 12 states and territories have a cigarette tax rate between $2.00 and $2.99 per pack. 6 states or territories have cigarette tax rates between $3.00 and $3.99 a pack. And 4 states or territories have cigarette tax rates higher than $4 a pack. Missouri's tax rate is the lowest at 17 cents a pack. Puerto Rico's tax rate is the highest at $5, $10 a pack. Figure 13. 3 governments can use taxes to try to influence behavior. The average state tax on a pack of cigarettes in the United States in December 2021 was $191. Source: Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax under CC BY 40 license. Beyond taxation, governmental leaders can use their office to influence public opinion. Governmental authorities are often authorized to use the government's assets to promote their policies. The President of the United States, for example, is authorized to use Air Force One, the presidential jet, to travel the country in order to promote policy proposals. Presidents are not, however, allowed to use Air Force One for free to conduct political fundraising. Additionally, members of the United States Congress are authorized to send letters to constituents free of charge, describing or defending the policies they support. Tools like these allow governments to exercise the power of influence and persuasion. The chief executive is usually the governmental official who takes the greatest advantage of this form of power. In the United States, presidents such as Teddy Roosevelt became famous for skillfully using the bully pulpit, that is, the power of the president to shape the opinions of the population, and through this, potentially to influence members of other branches of the government, especially elected legislators. Presidents and prime ministers often give speeches or issue proclamations to exert this power. President Barack Obama, for example, following a long tradition in American politics, spoke often of what we as Americans value as a way to persuade the populace to support the policy agenda of his administration. Take the following example from one of Obama's speeches. In the speech, he defended his administration's decision to change the priorities of federal immigration officials to less rigorously enforce laws requiring the deportation of undocumented individuals when those individuals entered the country as children, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, program. Arguing that children brought to the country by their parents should not have to live in fear of deportation, Obama remarked, "My fellow Americans, we are and always will be a nation of immigrants. We were strangers once too. And whether our forebears were strangers who crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Rio Grande, we are here only because this country welcomed them in and taught them that to be an American is about something more than what we look like, or what our last names are, or how we worship. What makes us Americans is our shared commitment to an ideal that all of us are created equal and all of us have the chance to make of our lives what we will." Emphasis added 6. By using rhetoric that attempts to define the national ethos, governments can seek to exercise power by shaping the population's sense of itself and its place in history. Legitimacy. Most governments establish authority not only to exercise power, but also in the pursuit of legitimacy. Legitimacy can be seen from two different vantage points. Following Weber, the term is often used to mean the widespread belief that the government has the right to exercise its power. In this sense, which can be called broad legitimacy, the concept describes a government trait. Legitimacy can also be seen from the perspective of individuals or groups who make determinations about whether their government is or is not legitimate, that is, rightfully exercising power, or what can be called judgments about legitimacy. In either sense, legitimacy is measured in perceptions of the rightfulness of government actions, the sense that those actions are morally appropriate and consistent with basic justice and social welfare. It is quite possible for a small group or a small set of groups to conclude that their government is illegitimate and so does not have the right to exercise authorized power, even as the vast majority think that government is rightfully exercising authorized power. In this case, since the dissenting group is small and the great majority see their government as legitimate, the state can be deemed broadly legitimate. Broad legitimacy, therefore, is defined not as unanimous agreement by the people that a government's authority is rightfully exercised, but simply as a broad sentiment that it is. Video. Finding legitimacy. What does legitimacy mean to you? In this Center for Public Impact video, people from around the world talk about what government legitimacy means to them. Legitimacy is a vague concept. Citizens' judgments about legitimacy entail the often difficult determinations of what is or is not rightful and thus consistent with morality, justice, and social welfare. Judging rightfulness can be a challenging task, as can the determination of whether a regime truly possesses broad legitimacy. Though you cannot always say for certain that a government truly has broad legitimacy, broad illegitimacy is often easy to detect. Indications of governments that do not have broad legitimacy can take many forms, including sustained protests, very low levels of trust in the regime as captured by polling data, and widespread calls for revising or abandoning the Constitution. The most effective governments, Weber argued, not only have laws that clearly authorize power, but also have some substantial measure of broad legitimacy. Broadly legitimate governments can exercise power without the threat of popular rebellion, and the state can more readily rely on people to follow the law. These conditions can spare the government the cost of large standing police forces or militaries, and those resources in turn can be allocated in other areas. Unsurprisingly, most governments seek to legitimize their rule. In the United States, many debates over rival understandings of law and public policy are not debates over legitimacy. For example, many groups in the United States disagree over certain tax policies. Some want to increase taxes to pay for greater services, while others want to lower taxes to encourage economic growth. Yet those who oppose a particular tax law rarely refer to it as illegitimate, since the law is recognized as coming from a process that has widespread popular support, that is, from the lawmaking process authorized in the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, tax laws that many disfavor are usually not seen as illegitimate, but simply as unpopular or unwise and thus in need of change. However, in the United States today, more and more debates surrounding law, public policy, and election results are expressed in terms of judgments of their legitimacy or illegitimacy. A true loss of legitimacy, either in the eyes of a small group or in the eyes of the broad populace, occurs only when a law is determined to be so wrong or harmful that it is not right for the government to enact it. In many cases in the United States today, allegations of illegitimacy contend not that a law or electoral result lacks legitimacy because the substance of the law or election outcome is so egregious that it is not a rightful thing for the government to do or to permit, but because they claim the U.S. Constitution does not authorize the law or the process that resulted in a particular outcome. Consider the 2020 election and debates involving the administration of President Joe Biden. Many supporters of Donald Trump hold that President Biden is an illegitimate president. But they contend not so much that he is so unacceptable that his holding the office of president is inconsistent with morality, justice, and social welfare, but that the governmental officials in charge of running the 2020 presidential election process acted inappropriately or even, some contend, engaged in criminal ballot tampering. For these reasons, to them Biden's current presidency is unrightful because they see the process by which he was elected as unauthorized. 8. Numerous post-election audits have found the allegations to be without merit. 9. In an April 2021 poll, about 3/4 of Republicans, 1/4 of Democrats, and half of independents indicated that they believe the 2020 election was affected by cheating. 10. These debates are complicated, and it is difficult to pinpoint the origin, rationale, and true motivation behind these judgments that the election results, for example, are illegitimate. What can be said is that there seem to be not only deeply rooted disagreements in the United States over what policies are best, but also deep disagreements about whether a variety of laws or governmental actions are in fact authorized by the Constitution, a development arising because of deepening disagreements among citizens about what the Constitution and the rules it contains actually mean. Protesters hold signs outside a large building. The signs read, "Voter ID law unconstitutional, P. A voter ID law is unconstitutional, and overturn Act 18. Figure 13. 4. In 2012, protesters held signs expressing their belief that Pennsylvania's voter ID law, which would have required people to have and present specific types of identification in order to vote, was unconstitutional. The law was eventually struck down. However, the state legislature continues to work on measures aimed at creating stricter voting and election laws. Credit, PA Voter ID is unconstitutional by Rick Smith/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. Some public allegations that a law or electoral outcome is illegitimate in the sense that it is unauthorized may be mere covers for the genuine view that the laws or the electoral results are themselves unrightful, even if they were authorized. Those making such claims may not wish to be seen as protesting authorized governmental activity, since to do so could make them appear lawless or even revolutionary. Illegitimate exercise of power. In some cases, the constitutional law of a governing regime authorizes the suspension of established laws and regulations, allowing the government to act without defined limits on the scope of its authorized actions. A common way this can occur is in regimes that authorize the government to declare states of emergency that suspend the government's adherence to the ordinary scope of authorized power. There are strong reasons for states to resist invoking a condition of emergency. Clear lines of government authority, especially in the context of the state's criminal law, tend to make people less fearful of the state, allowing the state more easily to call upon the people for support and thus enhancing the state's legitimacy. Nevertheless, many regimes have the authority to declare emergencies, often in response to threats to public safety, such as terrorism, and to act in only vaguely specified ways during these periods. Video. 45 years ago, a state of emergency was declared in India. In 1975, during a time of social and political unrest, India's national government declared a nationwide state of emergency, allowing the government to suspend civil liberties. States generally see the establishment of public security as critical to their continued broad legitimacy. A state that cannot protect its people is likely to lose the widespread sentiment that it has the right to rule. Yet many states realize the potential negative consequences of unpredictable or unrestrained state action. For this reason, many regimes authorize the declaration of states of emergency, but only for limited periods of time. In France, for example, the president can declare a state of emergency for no more than 12 days, after which any extension must be approved by a majority vote of the legislature. 11. This power was enacted in response to terrorist attacks in 2015 and was renewed periodically until 2017. The state of emergency allowed, for example, certain otherwise unauthorized police procedures, such as searching for evidence without a warrant issued by a judge. 12. France's law authorizing emergency declarations dates to the 1950s, and that it is fully authorized by the French Constitution and widely approved 13 illustrates that in some circumstances governing regimes can legitimately exercise sweeping and unstructured governmental powers. 14. Where there is broad public support, regimes may periodically and legitimately reauthorize states of emergency. Take, for example, the State of Israel. Israeli law authorizes two different forms of declarations of emergency, one that can be issued only by the legislature and one that can be issued by the government's executive officials without the need for the legislature's approval. The first form, which allows the government to alter any law temporarily, 15, can remain in effect for up to 1 year and can be renewed indefinitely. This allows governmental officials to use sweeping powers restricted only by the vague statement that emergency enactments may not allow infringement upon human dignity. 16. In addition, the basic laws of Israel allow the Israeli government, independent of a declaration of emergency by the legislature, to declare a condition of emergency. 17. These decrees can remain in effect for 3 months but can also be renewed indefinitely. 18. Pursuant to this authority, the government in 1948 issued an emergency defense regulation that authorized the establishing of military tribunals to try civilians without granting the right of appeal, allowing sweeping searches and seizures, prohibiting publication of books and newspapers, demolishing houses, detaining individuals administratively for an indefinite period, sealing off particular territories, and imposing curfew. 19. This regulation has been renewed every year since 1948. Today it applies mostly to the West Bank. 20. Both forms of emergency decrees have broad support in Israel. 21. Indicating the popular sentiment that the Israeli government has the right to invoke such sweeping and unrestricted protocols because of the widely held belief among Israelis that the country faces serious and ongoing threats. Even when such declarations are authorized and have initial broad support, the extensive use of emergency decrees risks undermining the regime's legitimacy. In the early 1970s, then-President of the Philippines Ferdinand Marcos tested the limits of using emergency declarations to claim sweeping powers. In General Order No. 1, issued on September 22, 1972, Marcos declared, "I, Ferdinand E. Marcos, President of the Philippines, by virtue of the powers vested in me by the Constitution as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, do hereby proclaim that I shall govern the nation and direct the operation of the entire government, including all its agencies and instrumentalities." 22. As one scholar relates, Marcos took great pains to ensure that his actions would align with the dictates of the law. 23. The Philippine Constitution at the time allowed the president, in his role as commander-in-chief, to declare an emergency and to use emergency powers. 24. To ensure he could remain in office beyond the 2 four-year terms allotted to each president by the Constitution, Marcos called for a constitutional convention, which was ratified by the population, and which changed the position of president into that of a prime minister who could serve as long as the parliament approved. After an additional constitutional change in 1981 that made the office of president once again directly elected by voters, Marcos successfully ran for president, pledging to continue to exercise sweeping, unrestricted powers. 25. Marcos has thus been called a constitutional dictator. 26. One who came to rule with unrestrained power through a popular constitution and as a leader who himself enjoyed wide popularity. Video. Martial law in the Philippines. In 1972, the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, declared martial law. This video clip describes what led up to the proclamation and the extreme conditions in place in the Philippines under martial law. At least that is at first. Over time, Marcos's support deteriorated as people tired of his often chaotic and increasingly cruel dictatorship. By 1986, his people power revolution saw the electorate turn on him, and the United States pressured him to respect the electoral outcome and leave office. 27. A regime that assumes long-lasting, sweeping, and only vaguely defined authority as the Philippines did under Marcos can become a police state, sometimes called a security state. That is, a state that uses its police or military force to exercise unrestrained power. When states do not operate within clearly defined legal rules, political scientists say that the government in those states has little respect for the rule of law. Governments may also exercise unauthorized but legitimate forms of power. Although the absence of authority can be grounds for judging an exercise of power to be illegitimate, this is not always the case. Examples of unauthorized but legitimate government activities tend to fall at two ends of the spectrum of public importance. Governmental actions that are generally considered rather insignificant and actions that are deemed to be of tremendous importance, especially in grave moments of crisis. On one end of the spectrum, as a result of the Federal National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984, the legal age to purchase or publicly consume alcohol anywhere in the United States is 21. However, this law allows states to make exceptions to the age requirement for individuals under 21 who possess or consume alcohol in the presence of responsible parents. Not all states have created exceptions in their alcohol laws, and the possession of alcohol by anyone under the age of 21 is always technically illegal. 28. But in a number of these states, there is such widespread sentiment that possession is acceptable in the presence of responsible adults that there is wide agreement that the state can exercise the unauthorized power to choose not to enforce the law under these conditions. On the other end of the spectrum, during perceived moments of grave emergency, such as a dire terrorist threat, there may be broad agreement that the government may legitimately exercise the unauthorized use of power. Princeton professor Kim Lane Sheppell notes that since 9/11, a number of world governments have made quick responses to terrorism that violate the constitutional order followed by a progressive normalization. 29. These actions might be limited in number, and the broader population may be unaware of their details and scope. Nevertheless, it is arguable that the population is aware that its government is taking unauthorized action in response to terrorist threats and that it supports the government's right to do so. President George W. Bush speaks at a lectern in a room full of reporters. 3 large American flags stand behind him. Figure 13. 5. President George W. Bush speaks after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States. Credit 911. President George W. Bush delivers remarks on terrorist attacks from Barksdale Air Force Base, 9/11/2001, by the U.S. National Archives/Flickr, public domain. The illegitimate exercise of power and the challenge of revolutionary change. Some regimes, though they have established lines of authority, may come to be broadly illegitimate over time. Throughout history, there are many examples of times when the sense that a regime was no longer legitimate led the people to revolt, either by sustained, widespread peaceful protests, such as in the Velvet Revolution in November of 1989 that led to the dissolution of the communist regime of Czechoslovakia, or by internal violent regime change, that is, the use of revolutionary violence. Revolutions intent on removing a constitution almost always seek to replace one constitution with another. Is there a standard of justice that transcends the constitutional law of a particular regime, a standard that can guide a people as they seek to free themselves from one constitution and replace it with another? Historically, in the Western political context, the standard of basic morality, justice, and social welfare has been the set of natural rights guaranteed by the natural law. More recently, the standard is referred to most often as fundamental human rights. See also Chapter 2, Political Behavior is Human Behavior, and Chapter 3, Political Ideology. The meaning of these concepts, natural law, natural rights, and human rights, is often contested, and this disagreement complicates any efforts to establish new constitutions to replace illegitimate regimes. Successful revolutionary change faces numerous challenges, including the fact that people might agree that a regime is not worthy of support, but their reasons for that opinion may differ. 30. A black and white photograph shows people marching down the middle of a street along streetcar tracks carrying cloth banners. Figure 13. 6 protesters march peacefully down a street in Prague during the Velvet Revolution in 1989. Credit street photo from the Velvet Revolution in Prague 1989 by Joseph S. Hatchakramic ML /Wikimedia Commons CC by 40. In the 1930s and 1940s in India, Mahatma Gandhi employed civil disobedience to protest British imperial rule. One way a group can seek to change a law or even an entire governing system is to engage in civil disobedience, the nonviolent refusal to comply with authorized exercises of power. In the 1960s, civil rights groups such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Rev. Martin Luther King Jr. used civil disobedience to protest racial discrimination. Although both started out as small protest movements, they grew into movements capable of undermining the broad legitimacy of the governing regimes they opposed. Methods of developing legitimacy. Widespread support for the right of the government to rule can come from a variety of sources. Max Weber argued that broad legitimacy develops in 3 primary ways. 31. The first of these is what he calls traditional legitimacy, where the governing regime embraces traditional cultural myths and accepted folkways. The United Arab Emirates can be considered an example of a regime with traditional legitimacy. Located in the far eastern section of the Arabian Peninsula, the 7 small states that make up the UAE are joined together in a loose confederation, with each ruled by a monarch or emir. This system aligns with long-standing traditional practices of tribal chieftains associating together in a loose alliance to meet common objectives. The second way legitimacy can accrue, according to Weber, is through charismatic legitimacy, when forceful leaders have personal characteristics that captivate the people. There are many examples of charismatic legitimacy throughout political history. Ruhollah Khomeini, a senior Shia cleric who died in 1989, held remarkable appeal in Iran in the 1970s. Seen by many Iranians as a stern man of God, he was widely thought to be unaffected by the wealth, power, and corruption that so many Iranians saw as typifying the regime of the Shah or King of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Khomeini was revered for his mysticism and his love of poetry. His personal magnetism played a large role in mobilizing Iranians to topple Pahlavi's government and to replace it with the contemporary constitution of Iran, which establishes a Shia theocracy, 32, a system of government in which religious leaders have authorized governmental power and possess either direct control over the government or enough authorized power to control the government's policies. 33. Video. Charismatic Che Guevara, Cuban revolutionary. Revolutionary Che Guevara is revered in Cuba as an anti-establishment hero. Weber's third type of legitimacy is what he calls rational legal legitimacy. This type of legitimacy develops as a result of the clarity and even-handedness with which a regime relates to the people. Take the example of Otto von Bismarck, 1815–1898, who, as the Prime Minister of Prussia, forged a united German state. This new regime gained legitimacy not only because of the shared German culture of the formerly independent German states, but also because of the efficiency of its state bureaucracy, which established a uniform system of law administered by trained public servants. Based on Weber's analysis, a regime can secure legitimacy if the following are true. Based on rational reflection, the people come to believe one of the following statements. The regime solidifies and advances the material interests of a large percentage of the population. The regime advances deeply held moral and/or religious principles or advances strongly valued cultural traditions. The regime both supports religious, moral, or cultural values and advances the people's economic interests. Based on an emotional sentiment, the people feel a strong emotional connection with the state. Based on a habitual respect for the government, the people unreflectively support the regime. Legitimacy can be thought of as emerging from the agency of the people, who give their support to the regime either as a result of rational reflection, emotional attachment, or the acceptance of customary ways of relating to political power. However, one should not think of the agency of the people, by which they confer legitimacy on the regime, as something that is necessarily wholly independent of the actions of the regime itself. It is possible for a regime to shape the way people relate to it. Regimes employ different tactics toward that end, including government-controlled education, state control of the media and arts and entertainment sectors, and associating the regime, at least in the people's perceptions, with the cultural or religious views predominant among the governed. As such, although some regimes may well enjoy broad legitimacy by the free choice of their citizenry, the possibility also exists that regimes gain legitimacy through what economist Edward Herman and philosopher and linguist Noam Chomsky call, in a different context, manufactured consent, that is, the shaping of the people's response to the regime by state programs and activities designed to instill support for the regime, programs that might begin early in the citizens' lives or that might affect citizens in subtle ways. 34 examples of this can include widespread and rather blatant government propaganda, usually defined as misleading statements and depictions meant to persuade by means other than rational engagement or subtle control over the content of what is taught in schools. The contemporary government of the Eastern European nation of Belarus provides an especially vivid example of a regime seeking to manufacture consent through a coordinated effort to control access to information. Until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Belarus was a part of the Soviet state. After it established independence from the defunct Soviet Union, Belarus adopted a constitution that, on paper at least, requires free and fair elections for major government positions and affirms freedom of the press. Upon taking office as president after his victory in the 1994 election, the current Belarusian president Alexander Lukashenko promised to allow broad civil liberties. 35 Yet, over the past 25 years, Lukashenko has exerted tremendous control over the media, including the internet. 36 Media content in Belarus is heavily restricted, such that opposition voices are almost never depicted positively. 37, and the regime has used its control over the media to promote Belarusian independence and Belarusian nationalism. 38 It is in this context that Lukashenko has continued to be re-elected. The support he receives can be seen as being, to a large degree, a function of his government's control over the formation of public opinion. To this extent, Lukashenko has followed the tradition of communist nations such as the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, which have a long history of controlling their people's access to information while advancing throughout society the state's preferred political messages. The exercise of manufactured consent may not always be so overt in other countries, but it may be just as effective. An illustration shows a crowd of smiling young people waving a red book in the air. A red sun sets in the background and Chinese text is written at the top of the poster. Figure 13. 7. This propaganda poster from the Mao era shows adoring Chinese citizens proudly waving their copies of Mao's so-called Little Red Book, which he had widely distributed throughout China and which was required in all Chinese schools. The book contains sayings and speeches by Mao. The text of the poster reads, "The world is yours as well as ours, but in the last analysis it is yours. You young people, full of vigor and vitality, are in the bloom of life like the sun at 8 or 9 in the morning. Our hope is placed on you." Credit, quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, talk at a meeting with Chinese students and trainees in Moscow, by Thomas Fisher, Rare Book Library, UFT/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. Failed and fragile states. When a state's ability to exercise control such that it can provide minimal conditions of law, order, and social stability deteriorates to a precariously low level, it is called a fragile state. Fragile states still assert the authority to rule but have serious difficulties actually ruling. The erosion of a state's legitimacy can lead to state fragility. A fragile state can also occur when a broadly legitimate state has its capacity to provide order depleted as a result of an external force, such as an invading army. 39. If a fragile state loses the capacity to provide minimal conditions of law, order, and social stability entirely, it becomes a failed state. A failed state can emerge either when a state has collapsed so thoroughly that it lacks any governmental power altogether, or when a shadow government has emerged. That is, an organization not authorized or desired by the government asserting rule over an area that effectively displaces and serves the same function as the official government. In this situation, internal violent regime change can occur, for if the shadow government becomes strong enough, it can mobilize sufficient power to dislodge entirely the existing regime and install itself as the authorized governmental entity. It may in the process have developed broad legitimacy, or it may simply have sufficient military power to take over the government, possessing the power of government and imposing laws that authorize its rule but not enjoying the wide support of the populace. A fragile government is one that is at serious risk of failing in either of these two ways or of experiencing violent regime change. In the early 2020s, a shadow government formed in large sections of Afghanistan, and the forces of that shadow government carried out violent regime change. From 1996 until 2001, the Taliban, an extremist Sunni Islamic movement, ruled the Afghan government. In 2001, in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks orchestrated by al-Qaeda, a coalition of Western nations invaded Afghanistan. Due to concerns that the Afghan government had allowed the al-Qaeda terrorist network headed by Osama bin Laden to operate within the country's borders, this coalition removed the Taliban from government. The coalition replaced the Taliban government with a governing regime that had considerable elements of representative democracy. In early 2021, a shadow government led by members of the Taliban resurfaced in areas of Afghanistan. In some of these areas, the Taliban enjoyed wide popularity. Writing in January of 2021, the reporter Mujib Mashal described one such area, the city of Aligarh. Aligarh is An example of how the Taliban have figured out local arrangements to act like a shadow government in areas where they have established control. The insurgents collect taxes and have committees overseeing basic services to the public, including health, education, and running local bazaars. 40. In August 2021, the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, fell to Taliban forces, and the more democratic regime collapsed. The Taliban has since consolidated its power, issued laws authorizing its regime, and sought to secure legitimacy among the broad Afghan population. Whether Afghanistan's restored Taliban regime will endure remains an open question. The current regime of Afghanistan represents a clear example of a fragile state. Fragile states either have a tenuous ability to keep the peace, administer court and educational systems, provide minimal sanitary and health services, and achieve stated goals such as conducting elections, or they are at risk of harboring within them rival organizations that can achieve these goals. Somalia is another example of a fragile state. 41. In more than 30 years of civil war, the regime governing Somalia has at times been at risk of failing to provide even a minimal level of security and stability. The condition in the country has stabilized somewhat from its low point in the early 1990s, when the risk of famine was so acute that the United States deployed military troops in Somalia to protect United Nations workers providing humanitarian relief in the country, a deployment that became controversial in the United States due to significant U.S. military casualties. 42. Somalia, however, still shows signs of fragility. Although the Somali government scheduled national elections to take place in the summer of 2021, the first to be held in decades, these elections have been indefinitely postponed in the face of continuing instability in the region. 43. UN troops in blue helmets and tan uniforms and carrying weapons board a UN Refugee Agency aircraft. Figure 13. 8 UN troops from Pakistan board a United States Air Force plane bound for Somalia in 1992. Credit: UN troops from Pakistan board USAF C-130 bound for Mogadishu, Somalia by TSGT Marv Linchard / Department of Defense National Archives, public domain. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to apply core concepts to contemporary examples of governing regimes. Discuss the nature and variety of authoritarian regimes. Discuss the nature and variety of representative regimes. Analyze the connections among legitimacy, authoritarian governments, and representative governments. Provide an overview of political history and contemporary political and legal developments. Regimes approach the acquisition, maintenance, and exercise of authority and legitimacy in many different ways. Though the range of regimes is staggering, there are a number of generalizations that characterize the rich diversity of the world's governing regimes. Authoritarianism. Authoritarian regimes authorize institutions, which in principle need not seek or secure the approval of the people, to use power. Authoritarian regimes can confer governmental power unchecked by popular elections in a wide variety of entities, including in the military, in religious leaders, in a monarchy, or in political parties espousing a particular political ideology. As a number of scholars have long noted, authoritarianism can take either a hard or a soft form. 44. In hard authoritarianism, regimes act without consulting with the broad majority of citizens. International observers frequently cite these regimes as violators of their citizens' human rights. In soft authoritarianism, on the other hand, regimes affirm their right to rule apart from consultation with or approval from the public, but nevertheless frequently seek the input of the people and frequently attempt to advance what the people desire. They may even have institutions with limited degrees of authorized power that are electorally accountable, and thus can be seen as a hybrid of authoritarianism and democracy, although in these cases the unaccountable element in the regime can usually override the actions democratically elected bodies undertake. Recent studies indicate that the number of these hybrid forms of authoritarianism grew in 2020. 45. Although non-democratic, these regimes sometimes prove to be relatively strong defenders of their citizens' human rights, except, that is, for what many see as the basic human right to vote or otherwise shape in a formal, legal way the actions of one's government. Authoritarianism and legitimacy. In some authoritarian regimes, there may be nothing to move the regime toward alignment with broadly held popular sentiments about what gives the regime the right to rule. In these regimes, the government may seek to engage, often in a systematic and pervasive manner, in the education of the populace, guiding the people to value the regime, its objectives, and its right to rule. This can take a variety of forms, including strict control over the education of the young, regulations on criticisms of the regime, and extensive government propaganda. These authoritarian regimes are often accused of manufacturing consent. In addition, authoritarian regimes may rely more heavily than representative governments on physical force to compel obedience to the regime. This fact raises the prospect that the regime will violate citizens' human rights. Since authoritarian regimes may use substantial physical force to ensure compliance, they often develop large militaries and police networks. These enforcement agencies run the risk, over time, of coming to exert an unlawful level of control over the operations of the regime. Contemporary Thailand provides an example. Thailand is technically a constitutional monarchy, with the king subordinate to the parliament, prime minister, and the national court system. Recently, the state's military has become the de facto governor of the regime. The 2020 election for parliament provided evidence of the military's power, as most international observers detected that the military had systematically manipulated the vote to ensure the election to Parliament of Representatives favorable to the military and its political influence. 46. This development led to considerable protests against the regime. The legitimacy of the regime seems to be coming under question. Video. Why does Thailand have so many coups? There have been more military coups in Thailand in modern history than in any other country in the world. Morocco, an example of soft authoritarianism. The Kingdom of Morocco constitutes a contemporary form of soft authoritarianism. The King of Morocco is the head of state, that is, the leader who represents the unity of the country. In many regimes, the head of state has little actual power. The Queen of England, for example, is the head of state of the United Kingdom, but she has very little control over government policies and actions. In Morocco, however, the king plays a much larger role in governing the nation. Morocco was under the control of the French Empire until 1956. In that year, Morocco secured independence and created a constitutional monarchy in which the king had great authority. He was both the head of state and the head of the government, that is, the leader of the executive branch, and he exercised control over most governmental affairs. A bicameral legislature was also created, but it had very limited lawmaking authority. Popular uprisings like the Arab Spring, a substantial movement across the Arab world between 2010 and 2013, sought to expand democracy. In response, the King of Morocco approved changes to the Moroccan constitution, giving the legislature greater authority to pass laws on a wider range of issues. 47. Today, members of the parliament are elected in free, open elections in which up to 31 parties and coalitions vie for office. 48. The king is now the head of state, but he is no longer the official head of government. Unlike in the United Kingdom, however, although the king is called the head of state, he still exercises tremendous authority. Under the 2011 Constitution, the king appoints the head of the government, who administers the executive branch on a day-to-day basis. And the king still remains the head of the military and has the authority to disband parliament, to veto laws passed through the legislature, and to issue legally binding decrees on his own without regard to parliament. 49. The King of Morocco, therefore, still retains very substantial powers that enable him to override the will of the people as reflected in legislative elections. The Moroccan monarchy seeks to legitimize its rule largely on the basis of religion. The king is presented to the nation as the Emir al-Mu'minin, or the commander and defender of the Muslim faithful in his realm. The monarchy asserts that its lineage extends back to the Prophet Muhammad, furthering its claims to legitimacy in this Muslim-majority nation. 50. In terms of human rights, Morocco has a history of repression in the Western Sahara region and an overall uneven record as judged by the norms of Western nations. However, in 2016, the United States Embassy in Morocco noted the positive steps that Morocco has taken to strengthen its respect for human rights, although it also noted that more work is required to secure human rights in Morocco and in the region. 51. North Korea, an example of hard authoritarianism. One example of a hard authoritarian regime is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, often referred to as North Korea. North Korea is effectively a type of communist dictatorship. The most powerful person in the DPRK is currently Kim Jong-un, who took power by the decree of his father, who had taken power by the decree of his father, the founder of the DPRK, Kim Il-sung, a hero in the resistance movement to Japan during World War II. 52. Kim Jong-un possesses all effective political power and rules the society through his position as the General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea and as chair of the Central Military Commission. The DPRK Constitution creates three branches of government. The executive branch is headed by the Premier, a top-ranking member of the Workers' Party, and Kim Jong-un also serves as the country's president. Although the North Korean Constitution does create a legislature, called the Supreme People's Assembly, whose members are elected through a highly controlled process in which voters have no real choice of candidates, this legislature has no real power. 53. All members of the legislature must belong to an organization called the Democratic Front for the Reunification of the Fatherland, an ideological organization advocating North Korean nationalism. 54. The Workers' Party is guaranteed up to 90% of the seats in the legislature. A judicial branch also exists, headed by the Supreme People's Court. Because the legislature selects its members, they are not independent of the Workers' Party and its ruler, Kim Jong-un. 55. Through this system, the government maintains tight control over the economy and, in effect, over all property in the country. There are few, if any, civil rights. The state controls the media, and the government exercises control over who can enter and leave the country as well as who can live in and travel among the country's various regions and cities, with permission to reside in the capital, Pyongyang, a coveted plum. The regime seeks to justify its rule through Juche, the North Korean regime's ideology of national self-reliance. The government frequently seeks to stoke popular resentment, especially of the Japanese mistreatment of Koreans during World War II and of the United States' air bombardment of North Korea during the Korean War, a war North Korea initiated when it invaded South Korea in 1950. The regime in turn presents itself as the defender of Korean independence, as the only means by which the entire Korean peninsula can be united, and as the only way by which North Korea's interests can ever be served. As evidence of this, the government points to the substantial economic growth the country experienced in the mid-1950s, growth that eclipsed even that of South Korea, and claims that the country would once more enjoy this level of economic growth were it not for the sanctions imposed on it by foreign countries. To bolster these claims, the regime has developed an elaborate mythology, teaching that the ruling family is of divine or semi-divine origin, and that only through subordination to this family can the people themselves achieve genuine self-reliance. This subordination is not presented as degrading but as an act of familial love, since the supreme leader, the popular name for Kim Jong-un, is presented as a loving father and all North Koreans as his daughters and sons on whom he dotes and whom he is rearing to grow into true self-sufficiency and deep devotion to their country. 56. This focus on the noble character of Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather suggests that the regime's claims to legitimacy are based less on communist ideology or national self-sufficiency, and more on the alleged personal virtues of the men who have ruled the DPRK since it was founded in 1948. 57. A wide swath of corn kernels dry on the ground along the length of a block-long building next to a brick sidewalk on the streets in Pyongyang. Figure 13. 9 corn dries along the sidewalk on a street in Pyongyang, North Korea, as part of a traditional socialist farming practice emphasizing mass resilience in the face of natural disasters like typhoons and flooding. Credit: Drying Corn in the Middle of Pyongyang on the Sidewalk by Mario Miklish/Flickr, CC by 20. Case of Iran. Some regimes, like contemporary Iran, blend hard and soft authoritarianism. Contemporary Iran emerged in the wake of the successful revolution in 1979. The goal of the regime in Iran is to work to ensure that society is pleasing to Allah. The overwhelming majority of the population of Iran is made up of Twelver Shia Muslims. Adherents of Twelver Shia Islam follow the guidance of Shia religious leaders. 58. Grounded on these theological principles, the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran vests ultimate political authority in a supreme leader, who must be a Shia cleric of the Twelver school respected among the leading clerics of Iran. A guardian council of Islamic scholars works under the supreme leader. Under this is a parliament made up of 290 elected members. The voters also elect a president. The Iranian voters, however, have a very limited degree of influence over the Iranian government. All candidates for the parliament or the presidency must be vetted and approved by the Guardian Council, and the Guardian Council must approve all the laws the parliament passes. 59. Nevertheless, the voters do have some say in the operations of the regime within these strict limits, and a variety of political parties vie to have their members elected to parliament. As such, the regime can be thought of as a sort of fusion of hard and soft authoritarianism. 60. In light of the regime's ability to resist large-scale popular opposition, such as the Green Movement of 2009, when substantial electoral challenges were made to the status quo, it can be argued that the regime tilts rather heavily in the direction of hard authoritarianism. 61. Representative democratic governments. Unlike authoritarian regimes, representative governments only authorize governmental entities that are legally obligated to respond to and to be judged by the citizenry through periodic elections to make and enforce laws. These regimes therefore place most power in the hands of those who represent at least the majority of the people's political preferences. The exception to this rule is the power of judges, which can include the power of judicial review, or the power to strike down statutes or regulations that the court determines violate the constitutional laws of the regime. In some representative regimes, judges are elected, as they are in several U.S. states, but in other regimes, the branches of the government that are electorally accountable to the people make judicial selections. The judiciary can wield its power to strike down laws as unconstitutional in a potentially counter-majoritarian way, that is, in a manner at odds with the preferences of the majority of the citizenry. Since the 19th century, the number of representative regimes has grown considerably, partly as a result of the victory of representative governments against fascist regimes in World War II. Partly as a result of the fall of the non-representative communist government in the Soviet Union and of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s. And partly as a result of the third wave of democratization that began in the 1970s, which saw democratically accountable structures of government emerge in Spain, Portugal, South Korea, and, somewhat later, in Latin American countries such as Chile. These representative regimes vary in structure, though all share a commitment to ensuring that most authorized power is responsive and accountable to the nation's citizens. Representative regimes use periodic elections to select most office holders. The key legitimizing claim at the heart of representative regimes is that only when the people choose office holders to represent their interests does the government deserve the right to wield power. Unitary versus federal representative regimes. Representative regimes can be structured in a number of concrete ways. One point of differentiation among representative regimes is the distinction between unitary or federal. In a unitary system, all the major electorally accountable officials are accountable to the entire citizenry, and they make and enforce laws for the entire country, with the exception of minor local-level matters that are handled by local elected assemblies. Regimes embodying federalism authorize a national government to exercise some powers in governments whose laws cover only a small region, such as a state or province, to exercise other forms of power. One possible advantage of a federal regime is its ability to accommodate regional differences. Different areas often have different sets of values, cultural practices, and economic activities, and a federal system allows provincial or state governments to administer most regional issues, leaving issues of common concern to the central government. The Government of Canada provides one example. Created in 1867 as a federal system, the provincial government of Quebec has been able to reflect the historical connection between Québécois residents of Quebec, Catholicism, and French language and culture, while allowing other provinces to reflect their more British culture and values. Likewise, more rural provinces such as Alberta are able to focus on certain economic activities, such as oil production, cattle ranching, and agriculture, whereas more urban provinces, such as Ontario, can focus on areas such as industrial production and high-tech industries. By allowing provincial governments a degree of autonomy, the Canadian Federation has been able to knit together a diverse citizenry. Another potential advantage is the reduced possibility of widespread abuse of governmental power. Since the force of government is distributed among multiple governments, federalism minimizes the likelihood that one government will become corrupt or abusive. Consider the importance the Allied powers placed on ensuring that the government that replaced the conquered Nazi regime embodied federalism. After the surrender of the Nazi government in 1945, the Allies governed Western Germany through military governors who oversaw West Germany's reconstruction. The military governors, the most influential of whom were from the United States, had to approve the new West German government. They insisted that the West German government be structured according to federalism, with strong powers reserved to each state and only limited powers conferred on the national government. They looked to this structure of government in the hopes of ensuring that the new regime would not develop a concentration of power in the national government that could ever again emerge as a threat to international peace. 62. A black and white photograph shows a man shoveling rubble outside a damaged brick building. In the center of the outside wall of the building hangs a large sign written in German that includes the words Marshall Plan. Figure 13. 10. The Allies played an active role in leading and shaping the post-World War II recovery in Europe. The sign on the side of the building pictured here reads, Berlin Emergency Program with Marshall Plan Help. The Marshall Plan was a U.S.-led piece of the recovery effort. Credit: West Berlin, Germany. Marshall Plan aid to Germany totaled $1,390,600 and enabled that country to rise from the ashes of defeat, as symbolized by this worker in West Berlin. Even a year before the end of the Marshall Plan in 1951, Germany had surpassed her pre-war industrial production level by U.S. International Development Cooperation Agency National Archives, public domain. The third advantage of federalism is that it promotes more moderate policy outcomes. In a federal system, the central government retains some authority to make laws that impact the provinces, but it is not permitted to entirely override the province's authorized scopes of authority. In federal systems, national and provincial governments often have differing views of the proper degree of overlap between their spheres of authority. Defenders of federalism see in this disagreement a productive tension that can lead to compromise and that often results in prudent policy outcomes. In contrast, proponents of a unitary system see clear lines of authority as a major advantage. In a federal system, the laws of the regime can become a patchwork of rules and regulations at the provincial level, topped by an uncertain allocation of authority to the national and provincial governments. This lack of clarity can lead to inefficiencies in the way the government operates and inefficiencies in the economy. Defenders of unitary governments usually add that a unitary system allows the people to focus their attention on the way the government exercises its power. In federalism, the people's attention is split between the two levels of government, which can reduce the degree of focus on both. Defenders of unitary governments submit that representative government works best when all the people focus on the important work governments do on their behalf. They argue that the focus on one national source of lawmaking facilitates a stronger sense of national cohesion. 63. Parliamentary representative democratic government. As discussed in Chapter 9. Legislatures and Chapter 10, executives, cabinets, and bureaucracies. Some representative regimes are structured as parliaments. Historically, the parliamentary form of government emerged to provide a means for the quick resolution of pressing collective needs. In medieval England, where the parliamentary system first emerged, the king would call a parliament drawn from representatives of the commoners and of the nobility to agree on a course of action to meet a compelling threat or societal need, usually a threat or need requiring the king to tax the population to raise revenue. 64. To this day, parliamentary systems are structured to allow for substantial degrees of legislative action in a short period of time. If a party holds a majority in the parliament, it selects the officers of the executive branch, and thus a majority party can gain control of most governmental positions. A majority in parliament, therefore, can enact sweeping changes. However, parliamentary regimes may be much more fragmented. The State of Israel is an example of a parliamentary representative regime, and its structure has granted substantial influence to parties that represent only a small fraction of the population. Israel has a unitary regime in which the national parliament, called the Knesset, has the authority to pass laws for every region in the nation and at all levels of governance, including municipalities. 65. The Knesset is a unicameral parliament, that is, a legislative body with only one house. Candidates for the Knesset do not run for office in legislative districts. Instead, each party selects its own potential Knesset members, and each party is listed on a national ballot. All parties that receive over 325% of the vote receive the percentage of seats in the 120-member Knesset equal to their percentage of the national vote. The individuals selected by that party take the party's seats in the Knesset. Only the parties and not the individuals each party selects are listed on the ballots. 66. As with other parliamentary systems, in Israel the executive branch is made up of a cabinet of ministers, each of whose position is derived ultimately from having the support of a majority of the members of parliament. If one party has a majority in the parliament, that party will create a list of ministers and send the list to the prime minister, whose job is largely ceremonial and who is expected to approve the list. In the event that no party receives a majority of the 120 votes, a coalition government is formed. 67. A coalition government is an alliance of individual parties that by themselves do not have the support of the majority of the parliament, but that by agreeing to work together, can form a team of ministers that can acquire the support of the majority of the members in parliament. Once majority support for the list of ministers is secured, the list is sent to the prime minister for approval. 68. Video. Israeli coalition reaches deal to oust Netanyahu. In June 2021, a coalition in the Israeli Knesset reached a deal to oust Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. One consequence of parliamentary governments such as Israel's is that if the country is divided politically between major parties that each receive a great deal, but not a majority of the vote, and the two parties do not agree to work together, those two parties will vie to win the support of the small parties that hold the remaining parliamentary seats. If one of the large parties can form a coalition with enough small parties, it can reach the majority necessary to form the executive branch. However, small parties might not agree to give their support to larger parties without some assurance that their party members will hold a significant position in the executive branch. In this way, parties can come to exercise influence out of proportion with the strength of their support in the population as a whole. This has been common over the past 4 decades in Israel, as the conservative Likud Party and the more liberal Labour Party have each received about 40% of the vote 69, and both have formed coalitions with smaller parties, including parties representing the relatively small number of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. 70. In 2021, a group of non-Likud parties formed a coalition government with a small Arab party. This has given an Arab party, for the first time, substantial influence in Israel in excess of its overall percentage of the vote. 71. Democratic representative systems with a Congress, president, and independent judiciary and blended systems. In a representative constitution with a congressional legislature, a presidential executive, and an independent judiciary, citizens, broken up into sections or districts, elect representatives to the legislature. The president is elected independently of the legislature, and usually these two independent branches must either agree for a law to be passed or one branch, usually the legislature, can override a veto of the other. After laws are passed, a judiciary, whose decisions are independent of the legislature and the executive branch, has the right to strike down any laws deemed to violate the Constitution. The federal government under the United States Constitution may be the best-known example of such a system. The structure of the government of the United States serves the goals the United States government has historically set to secure the natural rights of the people while also providing common defense and facilitating economic prosperity. As the preamble to the Constitution asserts, the structure of federal government is designed to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The United States was founded on the belief that these tasks require a government that can act with speed when necessary but not so hastily as to permit the government to violate personal liberties. To this effect, the Constitution invests the federal government with substantial political power while also restraining that power, as discussed in Chapter 4, Civil Liberties, and Chapter 7. Civil rights. The Constitution restrains that power by itemizing civil liberties the government cannot revoke, a list found in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, and delineating civil rights the government must protect, a list found in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. For the same reason, the Constitution has been interpreted as authorizing the exercise of most acts of political power only when there is agreement among all three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, to reduce the possibility of governmental abuse. 72. Video. Separation of powers. This short video discusses the philosophy behind the separation of powers as it is included in the United States Constitution. The United States is not unique in adopting a regime that embodies a separation and balance of powers. The federal government of Mexico, for example, is also based on a separation of powers among a president, a national Congress, and an independent judiciary. The structure of the Mexican federal legislature, however, is different than that of the United States. The Mexican legislature blends a proportional system of representation with a system based on representatives elected in distinct districts. The Mexican federal legislature is bicameral. The lower chamber, called the Chamber of Deputies, has 500 members, 300 of whom are elected by voters in single districts. The remaining 200 seats are selected using a system of proportional representation. The 200 seats are divided among 5 large regions, each containing a number of states. Mexico, like the United States, is a federal system with state and federal level governments authorized to exercise distinct powers. In each of these 5 regional elections, each party seeking office is listed on the ballot, and the 40 seats for that region are allocated on the basis of the proportion of the vote each party receives. The Chamber of Senators operates in a similarly blended way, but through the use of a nationwide proportional vote. The Chamber of Senators has 128 members, 96 of whom are elected in districts, and 32 of whom are selected by a national ballot on which each party running for office is listed, with the 32 seats being distributed to the parties on the basis of their percentage of the national vote. What can I do? Regime types and data analysis. A graph shows each country's political regime type plotted against its human rights score. The 4 possible political regime types are 0 equals closed autocracy, 1 equals electoral autocracy, 2 equals electoral democracy, 3 equals liberal democracy. While the human rights scores range from around -3.8 to around 5.4, the higher, the better. Liberal democracies tend to have the highest human rights scores, while closed autocracies and electoral autocracies tend to have the lowest scores. Figure 13.11. This graph plots countries according to their political regime type and human rights protection score. Political regime types are plotted as 0 equals closed autocracy, 1 equals electoral autocracy, 2 equals electoral democracy, and 3 equals liberal democracy. Credit, Political Regime Type versus Human Rights Score, 2017 by Our World in Data, CC by 40. As you read through this chapter, you may notice connections and contradictions among different types of regimes. Political scientists often look for what they can learn from the similarities and differences among regimes, and how they can use that information to explain the behavior of states and other actors. This process involves collecting pieces of data about regimes and comparing that data through either quantitative or qualitative analysis. When you learn to draw conclusions from this type of data analysis, you better understand different types of regimes while developing a marketable skill. The ability to understand and analyze empirical and quantitative data is useful in a wide range of contexts. For example, retailers often want to understand and compare preferences across multiple different groups. Knowing how to analyze and interpret data can help you understand the similarities and differences between regimes or between consumer groups. At the end of the day, you use the same skill set. The federal executive branch in Mexico is directly elected by popular vote. The judicial branch is capped by the Mexican Supreme Court, which has the power of judicial review. The president nominates 3 candidates for each open position on the Supreme Court, and a nominee requires the approval of 2/3 of the Senate to join the Supreme Court. Each Supreme Court justice serves for a 15-year term and can only be removed through impeachment by a majority vote in the Chamber of Deputies, followed by a trial and conviction in the Senate, a process that requires 2/3 of the Senate to agree to remove the justice. 73. The government of Mexico has sought to legitimize its rule in large part through declaring, in explicit detail, the rights it recognizes and by dedicating itself to concrete measures of social, economic, and cultural improvement. The Mexican Constitution pledges itself to defend and promote a wide array of rights, far wider than the list of rights found in the United States Constitution's Bill of Rights and its 13th Amendment, banning slavery, 14th Amendment, providing equal protection under the law, and 15th and 19th Amendments, guaranteeing voting rights to all adult men and women. The Mexican Constitution includes all of these rights and many additional rights such as the right to have a decent and socially useful job, Article 123, the right to be free from any form of discrimination, which violates the human dignity, Article 1, the right to an education provided by the state that shall develop harmoniously all human abilities and will stimulate in pupils the love for the country, respect for human rights and the principles of international solidarity, independence, and justice, Article 3. The right to quality nourishment provided by the state, Article 4, the right to enjoy a decent and respectable house, Article 4, and the right to practice sports, Article 4. 74. In addition, the Mexican Constitution makes extensive reference to the rights of indigenous groups. As evidence of its responsiveness to the people's needs and desires, the government points to the fact that the Constitution has been amended over 200 times since its adoption in 1917. 75. In all, the vast ambition to advance the social justice these constitutional rights represent continues to supply the foundation for the claims of legitimacy of the federal government in Mexico. In the last several decades, however, a number of political scientists have documented a decline in governmental legitimacy in Mexico, due in part to the people's concern over the power of drug cartels to corrupt governmental officials and to run shadow governments, and in part to the rise of violent crime associated with the cultivation and distribution of drugs. 76. Increasingly, many Mexicans fault the government for its inability to effectively address these problems. Since so much of the crime and corruption causing the decline in Mexican governmental legitimacy involves illegal drugs supplied by violent cartels, the Mexican government has recently begun to explore alternatives to policies of criminalizing and imprisoning drug dealers. In 2021, the Mexican federal government took a step toward putting this new way of thinking into practice when it legalized the recreational use of marijuana. Whether this policy or similar policies will help the government to rein in organized criminal violence and to therefore enhance government legitimacy remains to be seen. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the connection between contemporary liberalism and political regimes. Examine the diversity of objectives and priorities set by governing regimes. Discuss political history and contemporary political and legal developments. Having analyzed core concepts and surveyed a range of governing regimes, this chapter closes by reflecting on some recent global trends. Contemporary liberal ideology affirms the importance of citizens having political freedom, that is, the freedom to participate in a meaningful way in democratic elections that can shape the actions of one's government. However, contemporary liberalism also affirms a wider set of freedoms, including both economic freedoms and such freedoms as freedom of speech, a free press, religious freedom, and the freedom to define one's own sense of personal identity, and to be treated equally by the government regardless of one's personal beliefs, practices, or sexual orientation. Although representative governments aspire toward liberal ideology in the sense of allowing political freedom, do they tend to respect these other freedoms? The answer is mixed. Among contemporary regimes, a number of representative regimes that are not fully in accord with this liberal ideology have emerged and persist. Hungary. Since the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, Hungary has had a representative parliamentary system. Although Hungary has a representative regime, one party, the Fidesz, an ideologically conservative nationalist party that currently enjoys popular support, has used its majority position in the Hungarian parliament to enact laws curbing a number of freedoms. The government has created a national media and communications authority that can impose heavy fines for coverage that it considers unbalanced or offensive to human dignity or common morals. 77. It has curbed religious freedom by requiring religious institutions to register with the state in order to receive the guarantee of religious liberty, and by designating only 14 religious communities as entitled to religious freedom. 78. It has failed to condemn certain outbursts of anti-Semitism in the country. 79, and it has banned same-sex marriage and adoption by LGBTQ persons, gender reassignment surgery, and the promotion of homosexuality to individuals under 18, as well as any portrayal of homosexuality directed at those under 18. 8. Video. European elections, exit polls show victory for Orban's Fidesz party in Hungary in 2019. The resounding victory of Viktor Orban's Fidesz party in Hungary's 2019 election represented a major success for nationalist politics in Europe. Some criticize certain acts of the Fidesz party, such as the way it has used its power in parliament to draw electoral districts to advantage its candidates, what is called gerrymandering in the United States, for undermining Hungary's representative system of government. Some further criticize how the Hungarian constitution allocates representation in the parliament in a way that favors certain regions of the country. 81. Despite these criticisms, the Fidesz party remains popular and has adopted its illiberal policies without contravening the basic structure of Hungary's governing regime. India. India, another parliamentary representative regime, recently has experienced a similar development. In 2014, a majority of the members of the Indian Parliament elected Narendra Modi, and since then he has served as India's Prime Minister. Modi's party, the Bharatiya Janata Party (BJP), has also won parliamentary majorities in a large number of India's state-level parliaments. The BJP espouses an ideology of Hindu nationalism, seeing India as an inherently Hindu country. Pursuant to this ideology, as of 2021, 8 state parliaments, each with a BJP parliamentary majority, have passed laws regulating religious conversion. Most observers view these measures as evidence of a fear that people will convert from Hinduism to other faiths. 82. According to these conversion laws, to change their religion, individuals must first have their conversion investigated by state officials who must be convinced that the conversion is free and fully informed. Otherwise, the conversion is illegal. 83. Human rights groups have argued that these laws inherently violate religious liberty by allowing the state to judge one's religious beliefs to determine if they are sincere, freely adopted, and fully informed. Moreover, human rights groups have documented how these laws are sometimes unfairly enforced so as to curb religious conversion, further undermining the principle of individual religious liberty. 84. These laws, if not the ways they are alleged to be unfairly enforced, have been adopted by a process that aligns with India's parliamentary system. Pakistan. In Pakistan, a country that, like India, has a representative government at both the national and regional levels, threats to religious freedom have also become pronounced. When the Indian subcontinent, a territory that included the modern-day states of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, achieved independence from British rule in 1947, Pakistan was partitioned from the rest of the subcontinent to allow for the creation of a government that would rule a majority Muslim population in accordance with Islamic values. Those who defend the legitimacy of the 1956 Constitution of the Pakistan Islamic Republic do so in large measure on the basis that it affords Muslims from the subcontinent a place in which to safely practice their Islamic faith in a social and community context reinforced by the social norms of a Muslim society. Since the overwhelming majority of Pakistanis are Muslim, their elected representatives are as well. Working within the parliamentary system, in the 1980s Pakistani parliaments passed laws that expanded the earlier laws against blasphemy, insulting speech or publications about a religion or its tenets that were in effect since Pakistan's founding. Until the 1980s, these laws were general, mentioning no religion or religious text specifically, and thus equally protecting all religions against blasphemy. In the 1980s, however, national and regional parliaments in Pakistan added to the blasphemy laws specific prohibitions on insulting Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran. The source of these laws appears to many observers to be a desire to shield Islam in particular from blasphemous speech. 85. Moreover, these laws define blasphemy broadly and require only a low level of proof to secure conviction in a Pakistani court. Human rights organizations have criticized these laws as being overly broad and unjustly enforced, and thus infringements on the freedom of speech and religion. 86. These laws, however, appear to be popular, and nothing in the Pakistani constitution prohibits the government from banning blasphemous speech. 87. Not all representative systems will tend to advance what Western political regimes increasingly see as the cornerstone of their own political legitimacy, the preservation of a broad range of personal rights and freedoms. Whether these regimes will move or be moved to do so in the future remains an open question.